In January of 1740, temperatures across Ireland plunged so low that farm animals froze to death, standing upright in fields. Rivers across England and France turned to solid ice. And over the next 12 months, hundreds of thousands of people starved to death in a famine that, proportionally, may have been worse than the Black Death. So how did the deadliest winter in modern European history just vanish from public memory? Nobody was paying attention to the weather in the autumn of 1739. Europe had other things on its mind. Britain and Spain were drifting toward war over Caribbean trade routes, a conflict that would soon be known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. France was busy maneuvering its continental alliances. The average farmer in County Cork or rural Lincolnshire cared about getting the harvest in and putting enough aside to make it through to spring. The usual concerns, nothing out of the ordinary. October came and went without alarm. November brought the first hints that something was wrong. Cold snaps arrived earlier than expected across the British Isles and northern France. By the second week of December, temperatures in London had dropped below freezing and stayed there. That alone was unusual. A cold snap in December was normal. A cold snap in December that refused to end was not. And what made this different from every other hard winter in living memory was that the temperatures did not bounce back. They just kept falling, day after day, week after week. The culprit was a massive atmospheric blocking pattern, essentially a wall of high pressure that parked itself over Scandinavia and would not move. This setup redirected Arctic air straight down across Western Europe like an open door to the North Pole. Normally, weather systems cycle through. Cold air arrives, sits for a few days, and milder Atlantic air pushes in behind it. But this blocking pattern held firm for weeks, then months. The mild air from the Atlantic could not break through, and the cold just kept building on itself, each wave reinforcing the last. By Christmas of 1739, the freeze was fully locked in. Temperatures across England, Ireland, France, and the Low Countries had plummeted to levels that nobody alive had ever experienced. Contemporary thermometer readings in London recorded temperatures dropping to around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and some nights went lower still. The old stories about frost fairs on the Thames and frozen canals in Holland, those were supposed to be stories, legends from a colder, rougher age. Suddenly, they were happening again in real time, and they were not charming at all. Then January 1740 arrived, and things got dramatically worse. The Thames froze so thick that Londoners set up makeshift markets on the ice. Vendors sold food and trinkets right there on the frozen river surface, and people walked across what had been a busy shipping lane just weeks earlier. It almost sounds charming in hindsight, like something from a holiday postcard. But the reality behind those frost fairs was brutal. The same freeze that made the river walkable was destroying everything else. Ships could not move. Coal barges could not navigate the frozen waterways, and London ran on coal for heating. The city consumed enormous quantities of it, brought in by barge along the Thames and coastal shipping routes. When those supply lines froze shut, the price of fuel skyrocketed overnight. Poor families in the East End faced a grim calculation: freeze to death slowly, or spend every penny they had on a single week of coal and hope the thaw came before the money ran out. The cold was not just uncomfortable. It was lethal in ways that people in the 21st century rarely think about. Water pipes froze and burst, cutting off drinking water. Wells froze solid. Bread dough would not rise in unheated bakeries. Ink froze in inkwells. The simple mechanics of daily life, cooking, washing, staying hydrated, became a constant fight against temperatures that human beings were not equipped to endure for weeks on end without modern insulation and heating. Outside London, the English countryside was suffering in ways that rarely made it into the newspapers of the day. Farm labourers, already at the bottom of the economic ladder, had no savings and almost no stored food to fall back on. Parish poorhouses, which were supposed to catch people at their lowest, were overwhelmed within weeks. In some villages, local clergy organised collections among the wealthier families to buy firewood and bread for the destitute, but demand outstripped supply almost immediately. Roads became impassable under snow and ice, cutting rural communities off from the nearest market towns. Isolated farmsteads went days without contact with the outside world. When the roads finally cleared enough for travel, constables in several counties found families who had frozen to death in their cottages, sometimes weeks earlier, with nobody nearby even aware they were gone. Across the English Channel, France was suffering just as badly. The Seine froze over near Paris. Wine froze solid in barrels in cellars across Burgundy and Bordeaux, ruining vintages worth fortunes. Livestock died in staggering numbers because farmers could not keep their animals warm or find unfrozen water for them to drink. In the French countryside, peasant families burned their own furniture to keep fires going. When the furniture ran out, they pulled thatch from their roofs. When the thatch ran out, they ripped up fence posts and floorboards. Anything that would burn. And when even that was gone, families huddled together under every blanket and piece of clothing they owned and waited. The French monarchy, despite its vast administrative apparatus, was painfully slow to respond. Local governors in the affected provinces sent urgent dispatches to Versailles, describing mass hardship, but the machinery of royal bureaucracy was designed for taxation and war, not disaster relief. By the time any meaningful directives trickled down through the layers of intendants and subdelegates, thousands of French peasants had already died or fled their homes. Entire villages in northern France emptied out as families dragged themselves toward the nearest city, hoping to find bread or shelter or charity. Many of them found none. The cold reached places it had no business reaching. Northern Spain saw prolonged freezing. Portugal recorded frost that killed olive trees and damaged crops that had never faced such conditions. Even parts of the Mediterranean coast experienced unusual cold that disrupted agriculture in regions that considered winter a mild inconvenience. This was not a regional problem. This was a continental catastrophe unfolding in slow motion, and it was only getting started. But the country hit hardest by far was Ireland. And to understand why the suffering there was so extreme, you need to understand what Ireland looked like in 1740. Ireland in the early 18th century was a colony in everything but official title. A series of laws, known as the Penal Laws, had stripped the Catholic majority of nearly all property rights, political participation, and access to education. The vast majority of productive land was owned by Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in England and rarely set foot on their own estates. They collected rent through local agents and cared very little about the welfare of the tenants who actually worked the soil. The native Irish Catholic population, roughly 80% of the country, survived on tiny plots of rented land. Their primary food source was not wheat or barley. Those crops went to pay rent and got shipped off to England as export commodities. Their primary food source was the potato, supplemented by dairy from small herds of cattle and whatever oats they could coax out of rocky, marginal soil. This system worked in normal years, barely. The potato produced more calories per acre than any grain crop in the European climate, and a family could survive on a surprisingly small patch of land as long as the harvest came in. But the system had zero margin for error. One bad harvest meant hunger. Two bad harvests in a row meant starvation. And what happened in 1740 was not just one bad harvest. It was a total collapse of the food system from the ground up. When the freeze hit in December of 1739, it destroyed the potato stores that Irish families had carefully put away for winter. Potatoes cannot survive a hard freeze. The tubers turned to mush, useless and inedible. Families who had rationed enough food to last through to spring watched their entire winter supply rot in frozen storage pits over the course of a few terrible weeks. And there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. The freeze held through January, through February, deep into March of 1740. Spring planting, which normally began in late February or early March in the milder southern counties, was impossible. The ground was frozen solid, several inches deep across the entire island. Even if farmers had seed potatoes left, which most did not, they could not get them into the earth. The growing season was cut short by nearly 2 months. And the crops that did eventually go in, late and desperate, produced thin, pitiful yields from soil that had been battered by months of relentless frost. The result was a famine that killed between 300,000 and 480,000 people in Ireland over the course of 1740 and 1741. Ireland's population at the time was roughly 2.4 million. That means somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 5 Irish people died in the space of about 18 months. Some historians argue the proportional death toll was actually worse than the Great Famine of the 1840s, the one that everyone remembers, the one they teach in schools and build memorials for. This earlier catastrophe was arguably deadlier on a per capita basis, and almost nobody today has heard of it. The Irish called it Bliain an Air, the year of the slaughter, and the name was well earned. People died in their homes, too weak to walk to the nearest town. They died on the roads trying to reach places where they hoped to find food or charity. They died in ditches and hedgerows along rural lanes, curled up in whatever shelter they could find. Contemporary accounts from priests and landlords describe entire villages found empty, with bodies still inside the stone cottages and nobody left alive to bury them. In some parishes, the death toll climbed so high that priests ran out of room in churchyards and began digging mass graves in open fields outside the village boundaries. The scale of death was beyond what local communities could process or even properly mourn. The cities fared only slightly better. Dublin, the largest city in Ireland and the seat of the Anglo-Irish Parliament, saw waves of rural refugees pouring through its gates, looking for food and shelter. The city had no infrastructure to handle them. Beggars filled the streets in numbers that overwhelmed even the most charitable institutions. The Foundling Hospital in Dublin, which took in abandoned infants, saw its intake surge as desperate parents gave up children they could no longer feed. Death carts became a regular sight in the poorer neighborhoods, collecting bodies each morning from doorways and alleyways where people had died overnight. Outside the cities, the countryside descended into something close to lawlessness in the worst affected areas. Desperate people raided whatever food stores they could find. Livestock theft, already common in hard times, became epidemic. Gangs roamed parts of Munster and Connacht, and local magistrates lacked the resources or the will to maintain order. The social fabric of entire communities unraveled under the pressure of mass starvation. Neighbors who had shared tools and labor for generations turned on each other when survival was at stake. The suffering was not evenly distributed even within Ireland. The western and southern counties, where the land was poorest and the dependence on potatoes was greatest, were hit the hardest. Parts of Kerry, Clare, and Galway lost staggering fractions of their populations. The eastern counties, closer to Dublin and with somewhat more diversified agriculture, fared better in relative terms, though better, in this context, still meant widespread hunger and death. The famine was made even deadlier by disease. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox all tore through weakened populations with terrifying speed. People who might have survived the hunger on their own could not fight off infection when their bodies were already breaking down from malnutrition. The sick crowded into towns looking for relief, and the diseases spread faster in those close, desperate quarters. Hospitals, to the extent that they existed at all in 18th century Ireland, were overwhelmed within weeks of the first outbreaks. Many of them simply turned people away because there was no room, no medicine, and no food to offer, even those who made it through the doors, and the response from the authorities was almost non-existent. The Irish Parliament in Dublin debated the crisis at length, and some members genuinely pushed for action. But the Anglo-Irish ruling class as a whole was far more concerned with protecting the grain trade than with feeding starving tenants. Grain continued to leave Irish ports bound for England, even as people died of hunger in the countryside, just a few miles from those same harbours. Warehouses in Cork and Waterford held stores of exportable grain under armed guard, while families starved within walking distance of the docks. Armed soldiers escorted grain shipments to the coast to prevent desperate crowds from raiding them. This is a pattern that would repeat itself with eerie precision a century later during the Great Famine, and it enraged contemporaries just as deeply then as it enrages historians reading about it now. The food existed. It was right there. It was simply being sent somewhere else, because the economic system prioritized trade over human survival. A handful of landlords attempted relief efforts on their own initiative. Some organized soup kitchens or distributed oats to their tenants out of genuine concern. The Church of Ireland set up some charitable distributions in a few cities. But these efforts were scattered, small-scale, and completely inadequate to the scope of the crisis. The prevailing attitude among the propertied class was that the poor were ultimately responsible for their own survival, and that disrupting the grain trade would cause more economic damage than the famine itself. That exact logic was recycled almost word for word during the 1840s, and it was just as wrong then as it was in 1740. If you are finding this valuable, consider hitting subscribe. We cover forgotten history like this every week, and there is a lot more to come in this story. The suffering extended far beyond Ireland. France lost enormous numbers of livestock during the winter, and the following harvest was catastrophic. Bread prices in Paris more than doubled by summer, and food riots broke out in several French cities. Crowds attacked bakeries and grain warehouses. The French government attempted price controls on grain, but enforcement was weak and smuggling was everywhere. Wealthy families hoarded supplies behind locked doors. Poor families went without, and many of them died. In the Low Countries, the frozen harbours of Amsterdam and Rotterdam strangled the Dutch trading economy. The Dutch Republic depended on maritime commerce, the way a body depends on a beating heart, and months of ice-locked waterways cut off that circulation at the worst possible moment. Shipments of grain from the Baltic, which normally supplemented local harvests and kept prices stable, simply could not get through the frozen seas. The resulting shortages drove food prices up sharply across the entire northern European trading network, from the North Sea coast to the interior markets of Germany. Scandinavia, which you might expect to handle extreme cold better than anyone, also took serious damage. Sweden and Finland experienced crop failures that triggered widespread hunger even among populations built for long, harsh winters. Rural communities in Finland saw families eating bark and boiling leather scraps for whatever nutrition they could extract. The duration and intensity of 1740 pushed past what even these cold-adapted societies had ever prepared for. The German states, fragmented into dozens of small territories and principalities, also felt the blow. The Rhine froze over in places, disrupting river trade that was the economic backbone of the region. Local rulers responded with varying degrees of competence, but the fractured political landscape meant there was no coordinated response. One territory might ban grain exports, while its neighbor continued selling freely, creating chaos in local markets and driving refugees across borders. The death toll also had a psychological dimension that is easy to overlook. Communities across Europe had lived through hard winters before. Cold was a familiar enemy. But the sheer duration of 1740 broke something in people's expectations about how the world was supposed to work. Winters were supposed to end. The thaw was supposed to come. When it did not, month after month, the effect on morale was devastating. Contemporary letters and diaries from across Europe describe a growing sense of dread, a feeling that the natural order itself had broken and that God or fate had turned against them. The total European death toll from the winter of 1740 and its aftermath remains genuinely difficult to pin down with precision. Record-keeping in the 18th century was inconsistent, especially in rural areas and among the poor. But modern demographic studies using parish death records and tax rolls suggest that excess mortality across Europe during 1740 and 1741 reached well into the hundreds of thousands. Some researchers put the combined figure significantly higher when accounting for disease deaths and the delayed effects of severe malnutrition that continued to kill weakened survivors well into 1742. So, what actually caused this level of cold? The atmospheric blocking pattern was the immediate trigger, but there is growing evidence that volcanic activity amplified the freeze beyond what weather alone could explain. Large eruptions inject sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it forms a haze of tiny particles that reflect sunlight back into space and cool the surface below. Several eruptions occurred in the late 1730s, including a significant eruption of Mount Tarumai in Japan in 1739. These events may have pushed already cool temperatures past a tipping point. This was also happening against the backdrop of the Little Ice Age, a period of generally cooler global temperatures that lasted from roughly the 1400s through the mid-1800s. The Little Ice Age brought shorter growing seasons, advancing glaciers in the Swiss and French Alps, and periodic crop failures across Europe for centuries. 1740 was not some isolated freak event. It was the single worst spike in a long-running pattern of climate instability that European societies had been struggling to adapt to for generations. The freeze of 1740 took an already stressed system and snapped it. The combination of volcanic cooling, the Little Ice Age baseline, and the stubborn atmospheric blocking pattern created something close to a worst-case scenario. Three separate factors all driving temperatures down at the same time, with nothing strong enough to counteract any of them. What makes this entire episode even more striking is how thoroughly it has been forgotten. Bring up historical famines in Ireland, and the immediate association is the Great Famine of 1845 through 1852. The potato blight, the coffin ships, the mass emigration to Boston and New York. That catastrophe is burned into Irish cultural memory and taught in classrooms worldwide. But the famine of 1740, which may have killed a larger share of Ireland's population, barely registers. There are a few reasons for this. The Great Famine happened during an era of widespread literacy, active journalism, and international media coverage. Newspapers in London and New York covered it as it unfolded. Survivors wrote memoirs and published letters that are still in print. The political debates were documented in official parliamentary records. The famine of 1740, by contrast, happened when the overwhelming majority of its victims could not read or write, when the press barely existed outside major cities, and when the ruling class saw no reason to document what was happening to people they considered expendable. There is also the fact that 1740 was triggered primarily by weather rather than by a single identifiable political failure. The Great Famine had clear villains: British policies, the landlord system, the reliance on one crop variety. These are specific failures you can assign responsibility for. 1740 started with a freeze that nobody caused and nobody could have predicted. That makes it a harder story to wrap into a narrative of blame, even though the suffering was every bit as real. But here is what deserves closer attention. The weather was the trigger. The death toll, though, was shaped entirely by human decisions. Ireland did not lose a fifth of its population because the cold was uniquely severe there. Ireland lost a fifth of its population because its economic and political system had stripped the majority of its people of any buffer against disaster. The land tenure system, the export of food during famine, the complete absence of institutional relief for the poor. These were choices made by people who could have chosen differently. That same pattern repeated across Europe. The countries and communities that suffered the worst were not necessarily the ones where the thermometer dropped the lowest. They were the ones where inequality was deepest, where food systems were most fragile, and where governments were least willing or able to intervene. The freeze did not discriminate, but the societies it hit were already organized in ways that concentrated death among the people least equipped to survive. By the summer of 1740, the cold finally released its grip. Temperatures crawled back towards something approaching normal, and farmers across the continent scrambled to plant whatever they could salvage from a devastated growing season. But the damage was too deep for any quick recovery. Depleted livestock herds took years to rebuild. Families who had eaten their seed grain in desperation had nothing to put in the ground. Communities that had buried a quarter or a third of their people did not simply bounce back when the weather improved. The demographic scars of 1740 remained visible in parish records, tax rolls, and local census figures across Ireland, France, and the Low Countries for decades afterward. In Ireland, the famine accelerated forces that would define the country for the next 2 centuries. Rural depopulation, emigration, deepening resentment toward English rule, and a growing conviction among the Irish poor that the system governing their lives was never designed to protect them and never would be. These tensions would erupt with far greater force during the Great Famine 100 years later, but they were already burning in 1740. The winter of 1740 is one of those events that reveals how thin the line between civilization and catastrophe really is. A few degrees of temperature difference, a high-pressure system that parks itself in the wrong place for too long, a food system built without any safety net. That is all it takes. We tend to think of ourselves as living in a fundamentally different world than 18th century Europeans, and in many ways we do. We have central heating and global supply chains and weather satellites and emergency response systems that would have looked like sorcery to a tenant farmer in County Cork in 1740. But the underlying vulnerability has not disappeared. It has changed shape. Our food systems are more productive than anything the 18th century could have dreamed of, but they are also more interconnected, more complex, and more fragile in ways that only become obvious when something breaks. The people who froze and starved in 1740 did not see it coming. The autumn before was unremarkable. The harvest had been adequate. Life was hard but manageable. And then the temperature dropped and did not come back up. And within weeks, everything fell apart. 300 years later, their story still matters. Not because the same disaster is guaranteed to repeat in the same form, but because it is a reminder that the distance between ordinary life and total collapse is shorter than any of us want to believe. If you made it this far, you clearly care about the kind of history that gets left out of the textbooks. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one.